The air was crisp and the trailhead was quiet as Ben and Carla set out for their weekend hike in the Appalachian wilderness. They'd been planning this getaway for months, a chance to disconnect, breathe fresh mountain air, and spend a night under a canopy of stars. The park was renowned for its beauty and isolation, offering adventurers miles of unspoiled forest. They wanted that isolation, or so they thought. The first leg of their journey was uneventful, almost serene. As they ascended deeper into the woods, the sound of trickling streams and rustling leaves accompanied their every step. But as they pushed further, Carla couldn't shake a feeling of being watched. She mentioned it jokingly to Ben, chalking it up to nerves or the eerie quiet of the wilderness. He reassured her, pointing out how the only thing they were likely to encounter was the odd deer. By the time they set up camp near a ridge, the sun was dipping below the horizon. As twilight gave way to darkness, the woods around them transformed into a black maze of shadows. They ate a modest dinner and talked about their plans for the next day, their voices carrying softly into the still night. Eventually, the two crawled into their tent and let the rhythmic chirping of crickets lull them to sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, Carla woke with a start. A sound, a faint crunching of leaves, seeped through the thin fabric of their tent. At first, she told herself it was an animal, perhaps a raccoon or a fox scavenging in the dark. But the crunching was deliberate, rhythmic. Footsteps. Slow, purposeful footsteps circling their campsite. Her heart thudded as she nudged Ben awake, whispering sharply, "Someone's out there." Ben groggily sat up, listening intently. The footsteps stopped. He peeked out of the tent's flap, his flashlight slicing through the darkness. Nothing. The forest seemed still, almost unnaturally so. "Probably just a deer," he muttered, lying back down. But Carla wasn't convinced. The rest of the night passed without incident, but the unease lingered as they packed up and hit the trail the next morning. As they descended into a valley, Carla noticed something strange. A makeshift campsite just off the trail. A small circle of rocks surrounded a burnt-out fire pit, and a tattered blue tarp hung from a tree branch. But what froze her in her tracks was the sight of a single hiking boot lying discarded in the dirt, its laces frayed and darkened with what looked like dried blood. Ben tried to laugh it off, suggesting it had been left by someone who'd had an accident and abandoned it. Still, they moved on quickly, their pace brisker than before. The trail felt different now, heavier, as if the trees themselves were watching. By late afternoon, they reached a clearing where they planned to camp for their second night. It was open, offering a wide view of the valley below. But as they settled in, Carla spotted something that made her stomach churn. A series of crude carvings etched into the bark of a nearby tree. Shapes that looked vaguely like human figures, contorted and strange, surrounded by spirals and jagged lines. Ben dismissed it as the work of some bored hiker or a prank, but Carla couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more. That night, they built a larger fire than usual, its flames crackling against the encroaching darkness. They sat in silence, both too uneasy to talk much. As the night wore on, the sounds of the forest began to change. The familiar chirps and rustles were replaced by an eerie stillness, punctuated by faint, almost imperceptible whispers. Carla turned to Ben, wide-eyed. "Do you hear that?" Before he could answer, a low moaning sound drifted through the trees. It was guttural and raw, unlike anything they'd ever heard. Then came the footsteps again, closer this time, heavy and deliberate, circling just beyond the firelight. Ben grabbed a stick from the fire, its end glowing red, and shouted into the dark. "Who's out there?" No answer. Just silence. Suddenly, from the shadows, a figure emerged. It was human, or at least it looked like it. A man, filthy and gaunt, with wild eyes that glinted in the firelight. He didn't speak, didn't move closer, just stood there, watching them. Ben brandished the flaming stick, yelling at the man to leave, but the figure remained unmoved. Then, without warning, he turned and disappeared back into the woods, swallowed by the darkness. They didn't sleep that night. As soon as the first light of dawn broke, they packed up and practically ran down the trail, their nerves frayed and their hearts pounding. But the forest wasn't done with them. About an hour from the trailhead, they noticed something strange. A crude pile of rocks stacked in the middle of the path. It hadn't been there the day before. On top of the pile was something that made Carla scream. A torn piece of fabric from her backpack, stained red. They didn't stop to investigate. They ran, pushing themselves until they reached the safety of their car. As they sped away from the trailhead, neither spoke, both too shaken to process what had happened. Weeks later, Carla couldn't resist looking up news reports about the area. What she found sent a chill through her. Over the years, there had been multiple disappearances along that section of the trail. Hikers who were last seen entering the forest, their belongings occasionally found in strange ritualistic arrangements, but their bodies never recovered. To this day, Ben and Carla don't know what they encountered in those woods, and they never went hiking again.
Story number 2.
It was late October when Sam, a seasoned hiker, decided to embark on a solo trip through the Cascade Mountains in Washington. He'd done solo trips before and felt confident, even in the colder, darker season. The trails were quieter this time of year, and he relished the solitude. Sam planned a 3-day loop through an area known for its rugged beauty and occasional bear sightings. He was well prepared, gear checked, map studied, emergency beacon packed. The weather forecast was clear. Everything seemed perfect until the first night. He set up camp deep in the forest, far from any roads or other hikers. After dinner, he sat by his small campfire, enjoying the eerie silence of the woods. As the fire dwindled to embers, Sam felt an odd sensation, like the weight of the forest had shifted. The air seemed thicker, the darkness around him more oppressive. He shook it off and crawled into his tent. Sometime after midnight, he woke to the sound of faint whispers. At first, he thought it was the wind, but it was too distinct. It sounded like several voices murmuring just outside his tent, speaking a language he didn't recognize. Heart-pounding, he reached for his flashlight and unzipped the tent. Nothing. The forest was still, his breath visible in the cold air. He shone the light around, but saw no one, no footprints in the dirt, nothing disturbed. He told himself he must have been dreaming and forced himself back to sleep. The next day, he couldn't shake the unease. As he hiked deeper into the wilderness, he noticed strange things. Trees with bark peeled away in long vertical strips, odd scratches on rocks as though made by claws or tools. And then the sound returned, the same whispers, faint and fleeting, as if carried on the wind. That night, he decided to camp near a small stream. The sound of running water was soothing, masking the unsettling silence. After dinner, he tried to convince himself he was imagining things, but deep down, he felt he wasn't alone. It was around 2 a.m. when the whispers came again. This time, they were louder. Sam sat bolt upright in his tent, clutching his knife. The whispers grew closer, more insistent, and then he heard a low, guttural growl. He didn't wait to investigate. He burst out of the tent with his flashlight and knife, spinning around to confront whatever was out there. The beam of light caught movement, a figure darting behind a tree. "Who's there?" Sam shouted, his voice cracking. No response. The growl came again, this time from his left. He swung the flashlight, but the beam revealed only trees. Then he saw them. Eyes. A dozen pairs of glowing eyes watching him from the darkness, just beyond the edge of his campfire's light. They were too low to the ground to be human and too numerous to belong to a single creature. The whispers turned into a cacophony, voices overlapping, some high-pitched, others deep and guttural. Terrified, Sam grabbed his emergency beacon and activated it, praying someone would come. The eyes began to move, circling him. The growls grew louder, more menacing, and then they stopped. Everything went silent. The eyes vanished, swallowed by the darkness. He didn't sleep that night. When dawn finally came, he packed up and started hiking back to the trailhead, his legs shaking with every step. But the forest seemed different now, darker, even in daylight. He felt like he was being followed, but every time he looked over his shoulder, there was nothing there. By late afternoon, he finally reached the trailhead, where a search and rescue team had been dispatched after receiving his beacon signal. He told them what had happened, but they were skeptical. Wildlife, they said, maybe wolves or a cougar. But Sam knew what he saw, or what he thought he saw, and it wasn't any animal he'd ever encountered. A week later, Sam received a call from one of the rescuers. They'd gone back to the area to investigate and found his campsite. But they also found something else, crude symbols carved into the trees surrounding his site. Symbols that looked eerily like eyes watching from the wood. Sam never went hiking alone again, and to this day, he refuses to talk about what he truly believes was out there in the Cascade Mountains.
Story number 3.
Josh and Megan were experienced hikers who decided to take on a lesser-known trail in the Colorado Rockies. The trail, known as Devil's Ridge, was infamous for its remoteness and steep climbs. Despite its eerie name, they were drawn to its reputation for breathtaking views and pristine wilderness. They planned to camp for 2 nights, far from civilization. The first day of the hike was uneventful, but as the couple climbed higher, the trail grew more rugged and less defined. It was clear that few people ventured here. By late afternoon, they reached a secluded clearing surrounded by dense forest. As they set up camp, Megan noticed something odd, a cluster of small wooden figurines hanging from a nearby tree. Each was crudely carved, humanoid in shape, and strung up with fraying twine. "That's creepy," Megan muttered, snapping a photo. Josh shrugged it off as the work of some eccentric hiker, but Megan wasn't so sure. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. That night, after a quiet dinner, they settled into their tent. The night was cold and silent, too silent. The usual sounds of nocturnal animals were absent, leaving an oppressive stillness. Megan had trouble sleeping, her mind replaying the sight of the wooden figures. She was finally drifting off when she heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping. She nudged Josh awake. "Do you hear that?" Josh listened, groggy at first, but then the sound came again. Tap, tap, tap. It was deliberate, like someone knocking on wood. He unzipped the tent and peered out into the darkness, flashlight in hand. The beam swept across the clearing but revealed nothing unusual. "Probably just a branch," he said, though his voice was uncertain. They tried to sleep again, but the tapping continued, now accompanied by faint rustling. Megan's heart raced as the noises grew closer. Suddenly, a new sound broke the silence. A low, wheezing laugh, so faint it could have been mistaken for the wind. Terrified, Josh grabbed his hatchet and flashlight. "Stay here," he whispered to Megan, stepping outside. The cold night air was biting as he scanned the clearing. The laughter stopped, replaced by silence so deep it pressed on his ears. And then he saw them. Just beyond the reach of his flashlight's beam, figures emerged from the trees. They were human-shaped but impossibly thin, their movements jerky and unnatural, like marionettes on strings. Their faces were blank, pale ovals, featureless except for deep, black holes where eyes should have been. Josh stumbled back into the tent, his face pale. "We need to leave. Now." Panic surged through them as they hastily packed up. The figures didn't move closer, but remained at the edge of the clearing, watching, their heads tilting in unison, as if studying them. The couple abandoned their tent and most of their gear, fleeing down the trail with only their flashlights and essentials. The tapping followed them, echoing through the trees, as did the faint, wheezing laughter. No matter how far they ran, it seemed to stay just out of sight. By dawn, they reached a lower section of the trail where the forest thinned out. The tapping finally stopped. Exhausted and terrified, they made it to their car and drove straight to the nearest ranger station. When they reported what had happened, the ranger's expression darkened. He explained that the area around Devil's Ridge had a history of strange occurrences. Stories of hikers vanishing, eerie noises, and sightings of stick people who seemed to emerge from the trees. Most people dismissed the tales as superstition, but the ranger admitted that seasoned hikers often avoided that area. Josh and Megan never went back to retrieve their gear, and they vowed never to hike in remote areas again. Megan deleted the photo of the wooden figurines, unable to bear looking at them, but she swore that sometimes, late at night, she could still hear that faint, rhythmic tapping in her dreams.
Story number 4.
A group of friends, Alex, Emma, Ryan, and Sarah, decided to take a weekend hiking trip into the wilderness of Vermont's Green Mountains. They'd heard whispers about an abandoned logging camp deep in the forest, known among locals as Whispering Hollow. The stories warned that the place was cursed, but the group brushed it off as superstition. It was exactly the kind of spooky adventure they loved. The hike to the camp was long and grueling, but they finally arrived by late afternoon. The camp was a cluster of crumbling cabins, their wooden walls blackened by time and rot. Rusted equipment lay scattered, and the air carried an odd metallic tang. Despite its eerie atmosphere, the group was thrilled to explore. As the sun began to set, they found an intact cabin and decided to set up their sleeping bags inside. Alex noticed something peculiar, a set of strange symbols carved into the door frame. They looked like spirals and jagged lines, similar to runes. Sarah joked that it was witch graffiti, but Alex felt uneasy. That night, after a campfire dinner, the friends gathered in the cabin to sleep. The forest around them was eerily quiet, as if the animals avoided the area. As they lay in their sleeping bags, They heard it for the first time, a faint whispering that seemed to seep through the walls. At first, it was so quiet they thought they were imagining it, but it grew louder, as if dozens of voices were murmuring at once, too low to understand. "Did you hear that?" Emma whispered. The others nodded, fear flashing in their eyes. Ryan, the skeptic of the group, grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside. "It's probably just the wind. I'll check it out." The others listened as his footsteps crunched on the dead leaves. Then silence. Minutes passed, but Ryan didn't return. Alex called his name, but there was no answer. The whispering began again, louder now, almost frantic. Panicking, they all ran outside, calling for Ryan. Their flashlights scanned the woods, but he was nowhere to be found. The forest felt wrong, the trees seeming to close in around them. Suddenly, a scream pierced the air, a blood-curdling wail that echoed through the darkness. It came from deeper in the woods. "Ryan!" Emma shouted, but Alex grabbed her arm. "We need to go back to the cabin," he insisted. Reluctantly, they retreated, barricading the door with a broken table. The whispering grew louder, now accompanied by faint scratching sounds on the walls. Sarah pressed her ear to the wooden planks, her face pale. "They're outside," she whispered. Emma began to cry as Alex gripped a rusted pipe he'd found. They sat in silence, too terrified to move as the sounds grew closer. The door rattled violently, as if something was trying to force its way inside. Then it stopped. Silence. For a brief moment, they thought it was over, until they saw Ryan. He was standing at the window, his face pale and blank, his eyes wide but unseeing. His head tilted at an unnatural angle, and his mouth moved, whispering words they couldn't understand. Sarah screamed, backing away. Ryan slowly raised his hand and tapped on the glass, in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. Then his face split into a grotesque grin, far wider than humanly possible. Without warning, he slammed his head against the window, shattering the glass. The friends screamed, scrambling for the door. They ran blindly into the woods, the whispering now deafening, as if the forest itself was alive and furious. Shadows darted between the trees, too fast to be human, their forms twisting unnaturally. The group ran until they reached the edge of the forest, collapsing in exhaustion near their car. Behind them, the whispering faded, replaced by an oppressive silence. Ryan was never found. The others reported the incident to the authorities, but no evidence of foul play was discovered. Locals claimed it was the curse of Whispering Hollow, warning that those who disturb the forest are never truly alone again. To this day, Alex, Emma, and Sarah refuse to talk about what happened in the woods. But at night, they all swear they can still hear the faint sound of whispering outside their windows, growing louder with each passing year.
Story number 5.
Liz was an avid hiker, drawn to the solitude of nature. She prided herself on finding trails off the beaten path, places where few dared to tread. One autumn, she stumbled upon an old, unmarked trail while exploring the Ozark Mountains. It wasn't on any of her maps, and that made it all the more intriguing. The trail was narrow and overgrown, snaking through dense woods where the sunlight barely penetrated. It felt untouched, ancient, as if it hadn't been walked in decades. The air grew colder the deeper she went, and the usual sounds of birds and insects faded until there was nothing but the crunch of her boots on the leaf-covered ground. After hours of hiking, Liz came across something strange, a circle of stones in the middle of the path. They were arranged too deliberately to be natural, each stone weathered and covered in strange, mossy symbols. In the center of the circle was a single withered tree. Its bark was black, twisted into grotesque patterns that seemed to writhe when she looked at them for too long. She felt a chill but dismissed it. Probably just an old ritual site or some kind of marker, she thought. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Liz pressed on, eager to make camp before dark. As she set up her tent near a small creek, she noticed something odd, a faint hum in the air. It wasn't a sound so much as a vibration, like the forest itself was alive and thrumming with energy. It made her skin crawl. That night, she awoke to a sound outside her tent. It was soft at first, like the rustling of leaves, but it grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't the sound of an animal, it was deliberate, like someone, or something, was walking around her campsite. Grabbing her flashlight, Liz unzipped the tent and stepped out. The forest was pitch black, her beam cutting through the darkness. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling. The rustling stopped. For a moment there was only silence. Then, from the edge of the woods, she saw movement. A figure stepped into the light. It was humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its body gaunt and pale, as if it had been stretched like taffy. Its face was blank, featureless, except for two hollow eyes that seemed to absorb the light. Liz froze, her breath hitching in her throat. The figure tilted its head, as if studying her, and then it smiled, or at least the space where its mouth should have been split open into a jagged, toothless grin. She bolted. Leaving her gear behind, Liz ran down the trail, her flashlight bouncing wildly. The trees seemed to close in around her, their gnarled branches clawing at her as she stumbled through the darkness. The hum was louder now, vibrating in her skull, disorienting her. She could hear the thing behind her, its footsteps unnaturally fast and erratic, like it was crawling and sprinting at the same time. When she thought she couldn't run any farther, she burst into a clearing. In the middle stood the same circle of stones and the withered tree, though she was certain she had run in the opposite direction. The thing was behind her now, its wheezing breath just feet away. Desperate, Liz scrambled into the circle and pressed her back against the blackened tree. The air was thick and oppressive, and the hum was deafening. The thing stopped at the edge of the stones, its head tilting again. For a moment, it seemed hesitant, as if the circle was a barrier it couldn't cross. Then it smiled again, wider this time, and began to laugh. The sound was unnatural, a distorted mimicry of human laughter echoing through the forest. It backed away, disappearing into the shadows, but Liz knew it wasn't gone. She stayed in the circle until dawn, too afraid to move. When the first light of morning filtered through the trees, she stumbled out and ran until she found her way back to civilization. Liz never hiked again. She tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, exhaustion, or maybe a strange animal. But sometimes late at night, she hears that hum again, low and faint, as if it's calling to her. And when she looks out her window, she swears she sees a figure standing just at the edge of the woods, watching, waiting for her to return.
Story number 6.
Ben and Claire, a married couple with a love for adventure, decided to hike the remote trails near Wrangell St. Elias National Park. The area was known for its breathtaking glaciers, untamed wilderness, and isolation. That's exactly what they wanted, a break from civilization. They chose a challenging trail that led deep into the backcountry, one that few people dared to attempt. Before setting out, a local guide warned them, stick to the marked trails no matter what, and if you hear anything strange, don't follow it. Ben laughed it off, thinking it was just a scare tactic. Claire felt uneasy but didn't say anything. The first 2 days of the hike were uneventful. The scenery was stunning, snow-dusted peaks, vast forests, and frozen streams. But on the third day, as they ventured deeper into the wilderness, they noticed something odd. The forest was silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an eerie stillness. And then they found the footprints. The prints were large, far larger than any bear or moose. They were humanoid but distorted, with long, claw-like toes that dug deep into the frozen ground. The tracks led off the main trail, vanishing into the dense trees. Probably just some prank, Ben said, though his voice lacked conviction. Claire wasn't so sure, but they continued on, pretending it didn't bother them. That night, as they camped near a frozen stream, Claire woke to a sound. It was faint at first, a soft, mournful wail that seemed to come from far away. She shook Ben awake. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. He listened, his face growing pale. The sound grew louder, closer, a haunting cry that echoed through the woods. It didn't sound human, but it didn't sound entirely animal either. Against Claire's protests, Ben grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the tent. The forest was pitch dark, the cold biting. The wail came again, this time from their left. Ben shone the flashlight in that direction, but the beam revealed nothing but trees and snow. He turned back toward the tent and froze. Claire heard him gasp. "What is it?" she called, but Ben didn't answer. He was staring at something just beyond the trees. She crawled out of the tent, her breath forming clouds in the icy air. Following his gaze, she saw it too. A figure stood in the shadows, tall and impossibly thin, its pale skin stretched tightly over its frame. Its head was elongated, with sunken black eyes that seemed to absorb the light. It didn't move, didn't blink, just stared at them. "Get back in the tent," Ben whispered, his voice shaking. But before they could move, the thing let out a low, guttural growl that sent chills down their spines. It stepped closer, its long, clawed hands reaching forward. Panicked, the couple grabbed their packs and ran, leaving the tent behind. The forest seemed to close in around them, the wailing now all around, as if the trees themselves were screaming. The creature didn't chase them, but its presence was palpable, like a shadow looming just out of sight. After what felt like hours, they stumbled upon a trail marker, proof they were back on the main path. But something was wrong. The trail marker was old and weathered, not the bright modern ones they had seen earlier. The ground beneath their feet was no longer snow, but soft, mossy earth, and the air felt heavy, damp, and wrong. That's when they saw the cabin. It was small and dilapidated, its roof sagging under the weight of years. A faint light flickered in the window like a candle struggling to stay lit. Desperate for shelter, they approached, but Claire hesitated. "Something's not right," she whispered. Ben ignored her and opened the door. The interior was empty. No furniture, no belongings, just a single, rotting chair in the middle of the room. But the air inside was warm, almost stifling, and the walls were covered in strange symbols carved into the wood. Spirals, jagged lines, and what looked like claw marks. Then the door slammed shut. The light in the window extinguished, plunging them into darkness. Claire screamed as the guttural growl echoed around them again, louder this time, coming from everywhere and nowhere. The symbols on the walls began to glow faintly, pulsating like a heartbeat. In a frenzy, they fumbled for the door, throwing it open and running into the night. They didn't stop until they reached the ranger station the next morning, frostbitten and trembling. When they told their story, the rangers exchanged uneasy glances. "That area is closed," one of them said quietly. "It has been for years. Too many people go missing up there." Ben and Claire left Alaska the next day, vowing never to return. They still wake up some nights to the sound of that mournful wail, as if whatever they encountered in the woods is still searching for them.
Story number 7.
Two college friends, Matt and Dylan, were spending their summer break backpacking through the Cascade Mountains. They heard about Deadman's Hollow from a local outfitter who warned them to steer clear of the area. "People go in there, but they don't always come back out the same," he said. The warning, of course, only piqued their curiosity. After a few days of trekking, they veered off their planned route to find the infamous hollow. It wasn't marked on any maps, but Dylan had read enough forums to piece together where it might be. By late afternoon, they stumbled upon it. A deep, narrow valley, cloaked in perpetual shadow by the towering pines. The air was colder, the silence oppressive, as if the place had been abandoned by all signs of life. At the base of the valley stood a crumbling stone structure, like the remnants of an old cabin or a hunting lodge. "This must be it," Dylan said, grinning. Matt wasn't so sure. There was a heaviness here that made his skin crawl. Still, curiosity won out, and they set up camp near the ruins. The sun dipped below the mountains, and the shadows stretched long and deep. That's when they heard it, the faint sound of a woman crying. It was distant, barely audible, carried on the breeze. "You hear that?" Matt asked, his voice tight. "Yeah," Dylan said, his grin faltering. "Probably some animal. Let's check it out." Reluctantly, Matt followed as Dylan grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the sound. The crying grew louder as they approached the ruins, echoing off the stone walls. It was gut-wrenching, the kind of sound that made your hair stand on end. But there was no one there, just the broken-down structure overgrown with moss and vines. Inside, the air was damp and cold, and the flashlight beam revealed strange carvings on the walls, spirals, stick figure-like shapes, and rows of what looked like tally marks scratched into the stone. The crying stopped abruptly. "Maybe we should head back," Matt suggested, his voice trembling. But Dylan's flashlight flickered, and in that brief moment of darkness, they heard something. A shuffling sound, like bare feet on stone. When the beam steadied, they saw her. She stood at the far end of the room, her back to them. Her hair was long, matted, and her pale skin almost seemed to glow in the dim light. She was hunched over, swaying slightly, her bare feet leaving wet prints on the cold floor. "Hello?" Dylan called, his voice cracking. She stopped swaying. Slowly, too slowly, she began to turn. But her movements were wrong, jerky, as if her joints bent in directions they shouldn't. When her face came into view, Matt stumbled backward, bile rising in his throat. Her features were twisted, her mouth too wide, stretching across her face like a wound. Her eyes were black pits, empty but somehow alive, locked onto them with a hunger that felt primal. She lunged. Matt and Dylan bolted out of the ruins, running blindly into the woods. Behind them, they could hear her, the snapping of twigs and the rustle of leaves as she pursued, faster than any human should be. The crying had started again, but now it was interspersed with laughter, deep, guttural, and inhuman. They ran until their legs burned, until they couldn't hear her anymore. Collapsing near their camp, they frantically packed their gear, too terrified to stay the night. They hiked through the dark, stumbling and falling until they reached their car at dawn. When they finally returned to town, they reported what they'd seen to the local ranger. The ranger's face went pale as they spoke, but he didn't seem surprised. "You're lucky you got out," was all he said. Matt and Dylan never spoke of Deadman's Hollow again. But sometimes when Matt lies awake at night, he swears he can still hear that crying in the distance. And when he closes his eyes, he sees her face, grinning, waiting for him to return.
Story number 8.
Lucy was a solo adventurer. She loved the challenge of hiking remote trails, finding solace in the vast emptiness of the wilderness. One summer, she decided to explore a trail in Canyonlands National Park that wasn't on any map. She'd heard about it from an online forum, a hidden path that supposedly led to a breathtaking view of the maze, one of the park's most remote regions. The trailhead wasn't easy to find. It started at an unmarked split in the main path and quickly descended into a narrow slot canyon. The walls rose high on either side, blotting out much of the sky. Lucy felt an odd chill as she walked, though the air was stiflingly hot. Strange, she thought, but pushed it aside. Hours passed, and the slot canyon began to open up, revealing a sprawling desert basin. In the distance, she spotted something unusual, what looked like the ruins of a small stone house perched precariously on a ridge. Intrigued, she decided to investigate. The structure was crude, more like a hovel than a house, and clearly ancient. Its walls were covered in petroglyphs, twisting shapes and symbols she didn't recognize. As Lucy stepped inside, the air seemed to shift. It was cooler here, unnaturally so, and the silence was oppressive. A sudden wave of unease washed over her, and for the first time in her hiking career, she felt truly alone. She turned to leave, but froze when she saw the footprints. They were in the dust just outside the doorway, bare human footprints, leading in but not out. Lucy's heart raced. She scanned the horizon, her ears straining for any sound, but there was nothing. Deciding she'd had enough, she started back the way she'd come. The sun was sinking lower, casting long, eerie shadows across the desert. As she entered the slot canyon again, she noticed something strange. The walls, which had been smooth sandstone, now seemed etched with shallow grooves. At first, she thought it was her imagination, but as the light faded, she realized the grooves formed crude images. Figures, dozens of them, stretched and distorted, all facing the direction she was walking. Her footsteps quickened. The narrow path that had felt adventurous earlier now felt suffocating. The silence was broken by a faint sound, a whisper, so soft she wasn't sure if it was real. She stopped, straining to listen. It came again, louder this time, a low murmur that seemed to echo off the canyon walls. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. The whispering stopped. She began to run, her flashlight bouncing wildly as the canyon darkened. The walls seemed to close in, and the whispers returned, growing louder and more distinct. They weren't words, but a cacophony of hissing and muttering that seemed to come from all around her. Then she saw it. At the edge of her flashlight beam, something moved, a figure, tall and impossibly thin, its limbs elongated like shadows stretched at dusk. It was facing her, but its face was wrong. Where there should have been features, there was only a blank, smooth surface. Lucy screamed and bolted, the whispers now a deafening roar. The thing followed, its movements jerky and unnatural, as if it were trying to remember how to walk. No matter how fast she ran, it stayed just at the edge of her vision, like a predator playing with its prey. Finally, she burst out of the slot canyon and onto the main trail. The thing didn't follow. The whispers ceased, replaced by the blessed silence of the desert night. Lucy didn't stop running until she reached her car. When she got back to town, she tried to tell her story, but no one believed her. The canyon, they said, didn't exist, and when she checked her GPS data, the route she'd taken was gone, erased as if she'd never hiked it at all. Lucy never went hiking again. She moved to the city, far from the wilderness she once loved, but even now, she can't escape the feeling that something is watching her, waiting, whispering just beyond the edge of her hearing.